when Mickey Sanchez asked me to talk, I couldn't resist because, you see, it was about my own book, and authors will never miss an opportunity to talk about that. It's that book you just mentioned, Wonder Confronts Certainty, which is about the basic trends of Russian culture. You know, you mentioned asking big questions. Russians don't ask small questions. All of Russian culture is asking questions. All the great writers, that's why they're so heavily philosophical. And they tended to divide between the, let's call them the intelligentsia, and the writers. They were pretty much mutually exclusive groups. The intelligentsia, people like Lenin, Trotsky were the most famous, but they go back. They were ideologues who thought they had the truth. That's the certainty part of my title, Wonder Confronts Certainty. The writers, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, they questioned that. They saw the complexity of the world that doesn't allow any easy answers. And they warned of what might happen if the intelligentsia gained power, which in fact they did in 1917. So the question I was going to focus on, my book asks, traces lots of the ultimate questions that Russians like to ask. And the one I wanted to focus on was one that obsessed them. It's all over Dostoevsky's novel, for instance. If you are really a materialist and really face the consequences of that, that is, you believe that there is nothing beyond whatever is governed by the laws of nature as describable by hard science, if you believe that's all there is, what are the consequences of that belief? For example, where would you get the notions of right and wrong, ethics, from? You could certainly get the idea that, well, by social convention there's right and wrong, but if that's all there is, then there really isn't any right and wrong, right? If the only thing that makes something a crime is that society has called it a crime and you might get punished for it, then it really doesn't have any moral content. That's a problem that really obsesses Dostoevsky's heroes. And I'm thinking in particular of the hero of the Brothers Karamazov, Ivan Karamazov, who is torn between two contradictory perspectives. One of them is that scientific worldview. And he simply knows as a scientist that people are just material objects, right? It makes no sense to ask, what is the meaning, what is goodness of material objects? If I were to drop a pen here, it would fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. And if I asked you, is that moral or immoral? Or what's the meaning of that? The question would clearly make no sense because they don't apply to laws of nature. But if all we are material objects exhaustively described that way, then questions of meaning and ethics have the same thing. They become meaningless. That's one thing Ivan Karamazov believes, but he also is terribly distressed by child abuse cases. He's collected all these cases from the Russian press, they're all real, of horrific cases of child abuse, describable in this book as only Dostoevsky could. And he really wants to say that those things are just plain evil, not because of social convention or because the laws of nature make him think it's evil. It's just plain evil. And he can't reconcile those 2 points of view. And he's written an article, which we have paraphrased for us. Its ostensible topic is really obscure. What should the jurisdiction of church courts as opposed to state courts be? But that's an encode. He doesn't like to talk directly. What he really means is something like this. Why should you not commit crimes? One reason, which is symbolized by state courts, is because you might get caught and be punished. There's a penalty. Well, but if that's the only reason, then if you're sure you shouldn't get caught, there's no reason not to commit murder. And what's more, there's no really moral content to it. There's no difference between murder and overstaying the parking meter, except that the punishment is worse, but no other difference. The other explanation would be what he symbolizes as church courts, which is it's simply morally wrong. It's evil whether you get caught or not. Okay? Almost all of Dostoevsky's novels are about crime. What is crime, right? These were the arguments that were obsessing intellectuals at the time Dostoevsky wrote, in the 1860s and 1870s. And his novels are just filled with these arguments. They're quite explicit in the novel. For example, determinism, which doesn't necessarily go with materialism, but it almost always does, although they're not logically entailing each other, but they almost always go together. If you really are an ironclad determinist, then it's hard to see how you could blame someone for anything, right? In fact, that is what the most influential radical, Nicholas Chernyshevsky, argued at the time. One ought not to blame people for anything at any cost. What people are entirely the product of their social environment, of social causation. They could not do other than what they do. If the judge who judged the criminal were in the same position, he would do it identically, because they're governed by the same laws of nature. So no one is really responsible. You could say society, that abstract entity, is responsible, but no individual is. Dostoevsky thought that such a perspective deprives people of their humanness, of what really makes them human. Material objects have no dignity. There's no human dignity if you know that material object. And what makes a person is where the material laws leave off. It's where your humanness consists. Take all the things that affect you, your genetics, your social conditioning, your brain physiology. You begin where all those things leave off. What makes a person, what we will cling to at all costs, is the sense that we cannot be exhaustively described from the outside. We are capable of surprise. And the worst way you can treat a human being is to treat him as totally predictable, because then you are making him into an object. We have a sense that our freedom, meaning our capacity to do what no one can account for in advance, is essential to our humanness. And if you take that away, you've taken away something that people will fight for. And when Dostoevsky, was in a political prison, he saw that prisoners, for no particular reason, would suddenly attack a guard, knowing what they'd be punished for it. But they just, at some point, just had to assert their capacity to do something that wasn't predicted. It was overwhelming. It was a matter of convulsions, right? Or they weren't alive. Similarly, if you were to take away freedom in another way, you'd be taking away their humanness. Imagine that, the utopians all believe, look, someday we'll have a society where people don't have to work for anything. They snap their fingers and they've got it. The socialist paradise. Imagine that would have happened. Well, for the first few months, you might be really happy with snapping your fingers. But pretty soon, you would realize that your life had been taken away from you. that nothing you did made any difference whatsoever, that effort didn't count, that you couldn't sacrifice anything of your own for your neighbor, that there was no ethical choice, there was no love. Above all, there was nothing to strive for that wasn't guaranteed, so your effort really mattered. And he summed that up with the line, happiness lies not in happiness, but in the attempt to achieve it, which may fail. So his first principle of ethics in Dostoevsky is always treat people as capable of surprise. Their efforts matter. Oh, lots of other arguments occur in his novels. There's the frame, well, morality can't be real because of cultural relativism. It's this way on this side of the Pyrenees, that way on the other, this way here, that way in China. Okay. Another one that is given, which sounds astonishingly modern, but actually existed in Russia as far back as 1862, was that you are nothing but your brain. And the neurons of your brain determine everything you do. You don't. You are reducible to those neurons. So that there isn't really any you. Just you think there's a you, but that's itself the product of those neurons. A famous Russian physiologist named Ivan Sechenov wrote a book called Reflexes of the Brain, where your actions are really fundamentally no different from reflexes like the way your pupil operates in the light. Or as that radical critic Chernyshevsky summed it up, there is a complete identity of the process which occurs in the nervous system of Isaac Newton when he discovered the law of gravity, and the process which takes place in the nervous system of a hen picking grains of oats in a heap of rubbish of dust. There's really fundamentally no difference. They're equally concerned by the brain. Well, it may seem liberating to think that there is no such thing as guilt. Okay, then we're not guilty. We can't be punished for anything. It doesn't actually work that way if you think. If guilt is irrelevant, and in the early Soviet period, in fact, in the Soviet period, that was the governing idea. Guilt doesn't matter. It's an old-fashioned notion for the reason that I was given. And since guilt is irrelevant, you punish not because somebody is guilty, but to prevent behavior you don't want to happen. Well, why wait for the person to do it? If a person is likely to do something, you can punish them in advance. It may seem unjust to us, but that seems because we believe in guilt. But if you don't, that disappears. And so you had preemptive punishments. Whole ethnic groups, for example, that Stalin thought might be not loyal in times of war, were lifted up one day in the marketplace. Someone would arrive with machine guns and deport them to Central Asia or Siberia, where they'd be left there to survive if they can. And this happened, to numerous ethnic groups. Koreans, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and so on that same notion. Preemptive punishment makes sense. Or as the Commissar of Justice Krylenko remarked, we protect ourselves not only against the past, but also against the future. Or in the early days, Lenin set up the secret police, the Cheka, within a month of seizing power. And the order of the leader of the secret police to his subordinates was, when you arrest someone, do not seek accusations or proof of whether the prisoner rebelled against the Soviet power by guns or word. First, you must ask him the social class to which he belongs, and that must determine the fate of the accused. If you're a bourgeois, you get shot. Don't ask what he did. It's preventive, okay? That's why in Soviet justice, crimes, potential crimes, were listed in the Code of Criminal Behavior as crime. For example, there was a crime called suspicion of espionage. Espionage was a separate crime listed elsewhere, but suspicion of espionage was a punishable crime itself. Similarly, you would punish the children of people arrested because they might grow up to seek revenge. So there were camps for children. There was also specifically a camp for wives of enemies of the people. They weren't accused of anything themselves. Lenin, on whose theories Soviet ethics was based, took very seriously materialism and atheism. It was his fundamental principle. And unlike other revolutionaries, other revolutionaries at the time would say something like, well, if you have to kill somebody, of course you kill him. That is not what Lenin believed, absolutely. Because it suggests that you're hesitant to kill a person. If you have to, you do it, but if you don't, you don't. You should not be hesitant because a person is just a material object, period. If you are hesitant to kill at all, it means you are covertly religious. It means you believe in the sanctity of human life or made in the image of God. And Lenin would punish people, who did that. Or as Trotsky said, we reject what he called, I'm going to quote now, the papist Quaker idea of the sanctity of human life. Okay? It was a crime not to kill a class enemy, if you could. Lenin's orders and Stalin's orders were always to use maximal violence, not as much as needed. Right? Arrests were often by quotas, arrest 30,000 people in this town. You can charge them with whatever you want. Local secret police officials getting this order would invariably ask to arrest still more, because if they didn't, it would show they cared about human life. It wasn't safe. Okay? In Soviet ethics, compassion was considered a vice. I don't know any other, system where children were raised, we raised children to overcome your basic selfishness and have compassion for others. Soviet children were raised to overcome your innate compassion because then you might not kill a class enemy, right? Any other ethics, the only principle of ethics, it was only one, was whatever was the interest of the party was good. And it wasn't, you understand, that the interest of the party was more important than the rest of ethics. There was nothing in ethics. If you think there was, it means you're a Kantian or a religious person who was not a materialist. Okay? There was no room for our concept of conscience. It was replaced, as memoirists like to say, with the concept of consciousness, as in class consciousness. The idea was only the result counts. The idea the end justifies the means. There was no other principle. So, you won't be surprised to find that at certain periods, mass starvation, deliberately imposed mass starvation, taking the lives of millions, was used deliberately, say, to collectivize agriculture, including the starving of children. What objection can you make to it? What? That, people are made in the image of God, that human life is sanctified, that people are not just material objects? But that's rejected from the start, you understand? They're taking materialism seriously. And then, people, Russian historians have often asked about why, let's say you would arrest people, why not just shoot them? But instead, they would charge them with a crime that nobody believed they had committed, and then they would go through various forms of torture. They had thousands and thousands of interrogators. Just think how much that cost. Spending weeks and weeks torturing people to confess to things that nobody believed. And then they would, send them off to Siberia. Many of them would die in transit. What sense, historians would make, did it take to waste resources that way? Or what sense does it make to take, let's say, someone you spent years training, let's say, to be a physicist or a doctor, and then someday arrest them and send them to, use a pickaxe in the frozen north, right, where it's 40 degrees below zero. What sense? It certainly wasn't economic. And, it's only when I was really reading and understanding Lenin and Soviet ethics that I realized the answer. It's the wrong question. You understand? We think to be cruel, you have to have a reason. But in Soviet ethics, not to be cruel requires a reason. It is the default position, okay? The same was true with devising more and more forms of torture. And I'd just like to read you one passage from Alexander Solzhenitsyn from the study of the Gulag Archipelago, one of the great works of 20th century literature. But here's one little passage comparing 19th century Russia with Soviet Russia. If the intellectuals in the plays of Chekhov, who spent all their time guessing what would happen in 20, 30, or 40 years, if they had been told that in 40 years interrogation by torture would be practiced in Russia, that prisoners would have their skulls squeezed with iron rings, that a human being would be lowered into an acid bath, that they would be trussed up naked to be bitten by ants and bedbugs, that a ramrod heated over a primus stove would be thrust up their anal canal, called the secret brand, that a man's genitals would be slowly crushed beneath the toe of a jackboot, and that in the luckiest possible circumstances, prisoners would be tortured by being kept from sleeping for a week, by thirst, and by being beaten to a bloody pulp. In that case, not one of Chekhov's plays would have gotten to their end because all the heroes would have been gone off to insane asylums. What this situation posed, the extreme situation, posed to people who were in the Gulag, in the camps, was a question inevitably arose. Should I try to survive at any price? And that means at the price of someone else, right? Steal somebody else's food. When food is short, just think of yourself. And as Solzhenitsyn says, most people would take that bargain, but not everyone. He said, the way he put it was, this is the great fork in the road in camp life, and you can almost say in all of life. Take the one road, and you may lose your life. Take the other, and you lose your conscience. Remarkable how many people chose conscience. Communist Party members never did. The one people you could rely on who would always act selfishly was a Communist Party member, right? Everyone knew that. But the people who were most likely not to act selfishly, to choose conscience, were the religious believers. And I read the memoirs of atheists, sent to the camps, and they all say, oh, these religious believers are dumb, they're stupid, they're uneducated. But you could trust them. Evgeny Ginsburg, who remained a communist, describes how one situation where a group of what she calls semi-literate believers refused to work on Easter. And they were made, now this is in the frozen north, right? So they were made to stand on the ice barefoot as a punishment, which of course they couldn't stand, while all the other prisoners looked on. And they just sang hymns, right? And the other prisoners asked, are they crazy? Or do they have a moral center that we do not have? The most recent Russian Nobel Prize winner is Svetlana Alexievich. Her work was interviewing people and getting them to talk about things in their lives that they had never talked to people before, because they weren't allowed to, because they didn't even dare say it to themselves, because they didn't have the right listener. She would get them to talk. And her books are the records of what conversation. And in her book, The Unwomanly Face of War, which is about women's experience of World War II, there's one passage of a woman she interviewed who had never said this to anybody before, but said it to her. I left for the front a materialist, an atheist. I left as a good Soviet schoolgirl who had been well taught. And there I began to pray. She tells Alexeyevich that it came home to her that she had killed people, that their deaths are on her conscience. Quote, I am old now. I pray for my soul. I told my daughter that when I die, she should take all my medals and decorations, not to a museum, but to a church. Give them to a priest. The land that took atheism most seriously, it's the land that most clearly shows why belief may not be so naive after all. I'll leave it at that.
Hello, my name is Collin Hansen, and it's been really a lifetime honor to be able to be on this stage with these two gentlemen. It's been a very kind of emotional experience to be back here. Just about 26 years ago, I can remember my parents dropping me off right across the way at University Place at South Mid-Quads, my dorm room on the second floor. And I was thinking about how I ended up back on this stage, and certainly Professor Morson is one of the most significant reasons why. I arrived here in 1999 studying to be a sports journalist, and I left writing books about the problem of evil, and I think I blame you for that, and continue to do that.
It's not too late to go back.
It's not too late. But when I think about where we want to go now in this discussion, and I want to make sure that we give the students the primary time. I'll ask a few questions, and we'll give you guys a chance to be able to talk here for the most of our time. Yeah. But I remember thinking that when I came here, I didn't even know. It's amazing to think, okay, well, I come in with all these big questions and I'm going to get answered. I didn't even know what questions I should be asking. Yeah. And that's part of what that education gave me, and one of the things that Professor Morson gave me there as well. And one last other introductory comment is just thinking about the environment in which we carry on these conversations, especially as our theme tonight about whether there's any basis for hope or optimism in this world. And we all know many, many heavy things that are happening in our world, in this community, on our campus, in all sorts of different ways. And that's made me think back as well to my time here. My sophomore year was the election of 2000, which many of you as undergrads would not obviously remember, not born yet, but was still counting the Chads in South Florida. That was a contentious time. And then right before I was about to get on a plane to come here for my junior year was the 9/11 attack. And so one thing just to encourage you is to think about, there are many ways that our era is unique and difficult, but in many ways it shares more in common with other periods of time that have been difficult over the years. So I want to make sure to give you a chance here to jump in as we continue to process what we've heard from Professor Morson. I think when we talk about hope, it's actually kind of the flip side of what you talked about, Professor Morson, with Dostoevsky and his concern about how we turn everything into just being a product of our environment. We turn people from having freedom into being objects. But I'm wondering, Esau, what is the basis of hope when you can't change your circumstances? I think that's how a lot of young people feel today.
That's a good question. Maybe I'll start by saying, at one point in college, I wanted to study and write about Russian fiction. So this might be my one chance to fire off my Tolstoy hot takes. And believe it or not, I used a line from, I think it's the Inquisitor, in my father's eulogy, where he asked the question, is there anything that our inevitable death does not destroy? And so all that to say is I've always found a kinship with the way in which Russian fiction wrestles precisely with this question of despair. And as I was listening to you talk about the person who went to the front as an atheist and who came back as a believer, I thought about my grandmother, actually my great-grandmother. She was a tenant farmer, picked cotton in the South. And she was illiterate, but she was deeply religious. And she would come to me and ask me had I said my prayers, and she kind of passed religion down to my family. And I remember when I got to college and I got to university and I started reading all of these books by David Hume, and I'm getting all of this language around questioning the problem of evil. And oftentimes the problem of evil is related to the question of suffering and human suffering, showing that there couldn't be a God. And I got really into that stuff as an undergrad. And then I remembered, and this is going to get to the question of hope, what was it that actually turned me, I came religious, went through the college doubting phase, what actually reshifted me towards something approaching hope? And I thought a lot about my great-grandmother, who didn't have the rhetorical brilliance of some of the people who I'd read in college, but they were talking about the thing, right? And she was in the midst of it. She was the one who was actually going through those things. And so her wrestling with suffering and evil and doubt as a concrete thing, and her conclusion there was something, a God that could be a source of comfort to her. I had to take her wrestling and her intellectual, emotional stirring as seriously that I could the people who had the leisure to write about it philosophically. And so it was actually the testimony of people who had suffered. And the question to me was, what was it about what my grandmother believed that allowed her not to be swallowed up by despair in the midst of a Jim Crow South? And I had to say, I had to take her piety as a theologically significant piece of data. And as I ran across the South, right, where I grew up, that same strength was always present in the people who I admired most. And I recognized nihilism hadn't liberated anybody. And so for me, it wasn't simply a pragmatic rejection of nihilism, but it was rooted in the people who I most admired had a sense of hope, moral certainty, and purpose arising from their deep encounter with God that I found compelling, that drew me towards them. And in the same way, it's been something that's been a source of comfort for me. There's a lot more that you could say, but I think there is actually, I'll put it this way, and then I'll give you your thing back. At the center of the African-American Christian experience is the question of theodicy, because we come to faith in a land that is marked by chattel slavery. So we've never not wrestled with this real question of why is there evil, and why is this evil seeming so unrelenting? And so when I open Russian fiction, even though it was totally different, they're wrestling with this exact same set of questions. So had I been a little bit better, and had I had the patience to learn Russian, I might have been doing your job.
Well, when I first came here, there was an African-American novelist. Do people still read Leon Forrest?
I've not,
Oh, he wrote
but I'm shockingly poorly read.
a wonderful novel called Divine Days. And we would just sit there and talk. He was getting his way of expressing his themes out of Russian writers.
Yeah.
Because he found the kinship there that he didn't find in happier people.
Yeah.
Right?
It also makes me think a little bit about Tolstoy's character of Dolly. Could you talk a little bit about prosaic love, how that fits in here?
Yeah, Tolstoy had the idea that what really matters most in life is not the grand, noticeable, dramatic moments and events. That's not what your life is all about. It's the sum total of the tiny events that really matter. And if you live those events right, your life will be meaningful. Whereas you think, well, I'll wait for the big moments. You'll live the big moments wrong too, right? Right? And, the hero of his novel, Anna Karenina, if you mean the person whose values he valued most, is just this ordinary mother, right? Who nobody respects. Well, she's just a mother. What do you want, right? But she lives the small moments, right? She's always thinking of other people, you know. She is the force of fundamental decency that nobody respects. But then we generally don't pay attention to what is really most important. That is the goodness that we have right before our eyes, if we just would do it, the opportunities we have, which are, as Tolstoy would say, they are hidden in plain view, right before you, but that's why they're so hard to see.
You often say that Tolstoy is giving us a hint that we should interpret a character based on how they treat children.
Yeah.
And that's where Dolly comes out. Professor McCaulley, I think of one reason I relate so much to your writing is you talk so much about family.
Yeah.
And I think probably growing up on a farm, I think a lot about family. It was next to my great-grandmother, my grandparents, been in place for a long period of time. And of course, when I'm thinking about family, I'm thinking about children. I'm thinking about my own children.
Yeah.
A necessary condition for preserving hope is resilience.
Yeah.
How do you help cultivate resilience in your own children, and what can the rest of us learn from
Yeah,
that?
it's funny because my kids are soft, gloriously soft. And I wrestled with this idea because when you grow up and you have to go through something, and there is something that is created in you through the overcoming of that obstacle. We like to say, like, I got it out the mud. And so the ability to fight through something so that you might have a better life creates this sense of the stakes are high. But the point of that is to not live that life anymore. And so if you succeed, then you raise children who don't know what that is like. And I keep telling my kids, you don't know what it's like, right? And so how do you actually then, without putting your kid, because I'll put it this way, the casualty rate of going through that is too high. So in other words, certain people do make it out, but that doesn't account for all of the people who don't. And so the idea that I'm just gonna toss my kids into that same context and hope that they survive isn't a good hope. But I do think there is this thing that is possible, which is like empathy. One of the things that I try to do with storytelling is the reason I wrote a memoir, like, why do you write a memoir? Because, the academics don't like it. They think you're not a serious scholar. What do I care? But when you tell a story, the whole point of that story is to link my children to a bigger story. And there are people who I met in my life, and that after I met them, I can never unsee them. And so after I met my great-grandmother Sophia and my grandmother Wavon and my grandmother and my grandfather who was the pastor, these people had an impact on my life, and they shaped how I viewed the world. But not just those people who succeeded, the people who suffered unjustly and who didn't succeed. And so by introducing those people to my children, I say, are you comfortable in a world that does this to these kinds of people? Or what kind of person are you as a result of having met the people who shaped me? And so part of it is storytelling. There's this interesting part. Can I talk about the Bible? I'm a New Testament scholar.
Yeah.
But I'm going to use the Old Testament. Is that okay? Okay.
Good with me?
There's this repeated refrain in the book of Deuteronomy. It's the book that the people of Israel receive right before they enter into the promised land. And there's a repeated refrain to care for the widow and the orphan. But there's a reason for it. The reason for it is, remember that you were slaves yourselves in Egypt. But that wasn't, most of the people who were there didn't actually have actual experience of slavery. It is saying to think of yourself as a part of the narrative of the people who've experienced something. And even though your situation has changed, you're never separated from those people. And so for me, what I try to do is to link my children to the story of the people of God who've overcome suffering, but that overcoming is not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of those who are behind them. So I'm less interested in making my children resilient in the sense of striving for some middle-class existence. I'm more interested in showing my children that they're responsible. There's a stewardship that they have because of the opportunities they have in life, not to forget about the people who don't have those things. And so what I really want to do is emotionally and spiritually link my children and anybody who reads my work to people who are suffering so they're not forgotten.
Well, go ahead.
I couldn't agree more, and I think I very much think the same way. And it's one of the reasons why, let's say, when I hear a phrase like the American dream, meaning a nice house and being well off and, and all the material things, and this, it turns my stomach because that's not what life should be about. It's not bad, of course, but to think that is, to make that a goal, the purpose of living, instead of what you say is, what you can learn by empathy, right? And that's why I think, nothing is better at teaching empathy than great realist fiction, because you live inside the consciousness for hundreds of pages of a person completely unlike yourself, right? Different culture, different gender, different social class, religion, whatever, right? And yet, you suffer when that person suffers, right? And that is a lesson you might bring outside and apply to other people who suffer. You can get it, take the leap inside their head that you've learned how to do.
Yeah. I had this moment in college. I was a junior, and I'd come home for Christmas break, and even though I'm like a clergy person, I don't have a lot of dramatic religious experiences, maybe like the connection in there. I don't get the audible voices and those kinds of things. But I remember I was sitting in my room, and this question came to me. It almost like erupted from inside of me. And it said, it posed this question, because this might seem strange, but I'd gone from having nothing financially. If you actually grow up poor, dorms are really nice. And the dorm that I was in was nicer than any dorm I had ever had, any room I'd ever stayed in. Had my own room for the first time. Y'all gonna laugh at me. I could go to the cafeteria whenever I wanted, 3 meals a day. Never got that before. I was doing well in school. I was doing well in athletics. And I was coming home from my Christmas break, and I was depressed nonetheless. And this question, and this is sound weird because I'm living in a dorm with 3 meals, but for me, this is like rich living. And the question was, what happens if you received everything you've ever wanted? It's not sufficient to bring you joy. And for me, maybe because I had lower stakes, right? Food and housing was like the highest, like I'd have made it. And I thought that food and housing would feel better than it did. And I found it insufficient. And the thing that has actually given me joy, right, is when I feel most alive when it is in service to someone else. And there's a real sense of joy that kind of erupts from me. I'm sorry, we're ignoring your questions.
No, it's leading.
So I want to say some.
I want
to say some more about Tolstoy. So I'm thinking about what you said about materialism, and believe it or not, what came to my mind was Flannery O'Connor and the story of the misfit. I use this story all of the time. Have you heard of the misfit? It's okay. Spoiler alert. The misfit deals with this. Trust me, we're going to get to hope. The misfit tells the story of this family that's going on a road trip. Spoiler alert, if you're not ready, you should have read it before now. The misfit pulls this family over, and they take them into the woods. And they're shooting the children one by one and the parents. And the last person who comes out is the grandmother. And the grandmother knows she's about to die. She goes to the misfit, and she starts talking about Jesus. She starts bringing like this religious aspect to it. And the misfit stops her. And the misfit says, don't talk about him because he's the one who messed everything up. Because he's talking about love and forgiveness and all of this stuff. And if what he said is true, there's nothing left to do but to toss away everything and follow him. But what he says is false, there's nothing left in the world but meanness. Then he shoots her in the head. And that's like the end of the story. And the part about that was really interesting, though, which relates to the Russian story that you were telling, is that what Flannery is trying to get at is that it's actually the misfit, not the grandmother, who actually understands the full ramifications of the claim, right? Yeah. He rejects it, but he understands it. Yeah. That there is nothing left. There's nothing but meanness. The reason that's important to me is because as I was having my materialistic moment, in college, I realized that what I really wanted to do was almost become like the grandmother. Embrace enough spiritualism to like push the despair away, but not embrace enough spirituality to make a real difference in my life. And so I think that what most of us end up becoming is like modified materialists. Like nobody wants to actually be Lenin. We want to get in some like hazy hinterland between where there is meaning, but not so much meaning there is a kind of purpose. So do you think, maybe I can ask you this question, is there like a modified materialism that can kind of function in the middle land, or you feel like we're in this misfit or like religiosity opportunity? Is there a hinterland somewhere for us?
Well, there are two meanings of the word materialism, right?
Yeah.
One is simply the philosophical doctrine,
Yes.
there's nothing beyond matter and the laws of nature. The other is, a materialist as someone who values the material things of life. I think in the first definition, if you are a materialist and live it consistently, you will live the way Lenin wants you to. But the second one is not at all incompatible with belief or faith. It's only if you make it, the goal of your life. But, I mean.
So you would say this: anyone who is not Lenin is not a consistent material, like in the philosophical category. Because I know materialists who don't go around murdering people.
Listen, I know determinists
Yeah.
who feel regret and guilt. But you understand, it makes no sense to be a materialist,
Yes.
to be a determinist and feel regret. Because it couldn't have been otherwise. It means that they don't believe what they think they believe.
Okay.
Okay?
Sorry, you can have your show.
No,
I need to get that out.
Let's take it to a contemporary example here. This is a quote that I came across in an essay last year at this time. It was a concluding line in an essay: "It is our soul, not our life, that matters most." That's you, writing in First Things last year, May 2024. The context there is Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader to Vladimir Putin, who died. He made that journey from atheist to Christian. Maybe you could expand a little bit more on that last line. It is our soul, not our life, that matters most.
Yeah, I mean, people know of Navalny, right, who was the poisoning of him. And then he, even though he survived this, poison which nobody survived, was cured after months, took months, in Germany. And he went back, right? And Natan Sharansky, in Israel, they had read each other, they knew each other's work. And somebody asked, I don't understand, they asked Sharansky, why did he go back? Didn't he know what would happen to him? And indeed, he was arrested and died in the camp. And Sharansky said, I answered her rather rudely. I said, with your view of the world, that nothing matters but your own life and survival and well-being, yes, it made no sense to go back. But he wants to be an example for his people. He wants to say to them, I am not afraid. Don't you be afraid. There was something larger than his self, called his soul, right? And that's what he was living for, right? It takes enormous courage. I mean, if you read the memoirs of Soviet dissidents, some of them are astonishing. I could recommend some for you, what they went through and why. And then Navalny is the one who, in the Putin era, is sort of carrying on that tradition.
Certainly, that's a central contention of Christianity. It also sounds like somebody who's read Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
There we go.
As well. Anything you want to expand on that point?
I mean, I think about Pettus Bridge. So, I got to take you to the South. One of the things that I've always thought really interesting was that we know about the marches that often took place in the South in the 50s and the 60s. They'd often be preceded by worship services. That they would worship first, and then they would go out and march. And the undergirding principle that led to that was motivating the Christian leaders of the civil rights movement was the transformative power of nonviolent sacrificial love. And that both had the opportunity to transform both those who were suffering injustice and those who were inflicting injustice. And what kind of courage does it take to go outside when you know there's the water hoses? There's this line that I quoted in Reading While Black when they asked one of the women during the I think it was the Montgomery bus boycott, or the Birmingham boycott. I think it was one of the boycotts. And they asked her, how do you feel? And she said, and this is broken English, because she was a maid, she said, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested. She had a sense of inner peace that arose from a confidence that there was a higher value than her own comfort. It was comfortable to accept the place that society had placed for her, but it was a real danger for her to risk her life and her safety. And undergirding all of that was the church that was at the center of that movement. And so for me, I think that one of the things that I always liked about the Black church in the South was we had no political power for the most part. We didn't have a lot of economic power. We didn't have the numbers. We didn't have votes. We were disenfranchised. So what do you have? Like, what do you have when you have nothing else? You have the truth of the thing itself. And so all you can rely on in that context is the power of God. And so for me, I've never placed hope in an analysis of the present circumstances. Because at any given moment, the circumstances have never looked good for me, but there's always been like providence, I think, that was guiding us through. And so I think the idea of hope residing from a sense of God's ordering of history has always been a part of my own understanding of the world.
I'm going to open it up for some students to ask questions. We've got a mic right down there, and we'll have some, you can line up, we'll take a couple questions at a time, but as people are gathering at the mic, and again, especially if you're a student, we'd love to hear from you. I teach civil rights history to graduate students. People are training for ministry in Birmingham, Alabama, and it is beyond evident that there was no real worldly chance that those folks would succeed.
Yeah.
There was no chance. If you're putting your hope in circumstances, there were no circumstances.
That's what I'm thinking
in
about.
their favor.
Watching the Lakers in the fourth quarter felt the same way yesterday. Sorry.
Well,
No rebounding.
Yeah, no rebound. So, yes, I'm sorry.
Soviet dissidents had a toast, and the toast was, to the success of our hopeless cause.
Yeah.
And there's a history, by the way, of that movement with that title.
Yeah, that's good. Let's get some questions. Come on up. There we go. Let's take a couple of them. Let's take the first two here, and then we'll divvy them up.
Hi there, my name is Luke, and I'm a student here. Professor Morson, I've in one of your classes now taken one of your classes previously, and really love. I've really enjoyed both them and all the ideas that you teach. But one question I have is that for people who might reject the idea of God, but still seek to find meaning in the world, kind of reject this materialist worldview as well. Do you feel like there's been a lasting source of meaning they've found in purpose, or do you think it's largely been found in just kind of relativist thought?
I'm sorry, it's not clear with that mic. If you could say it slower.
Yeah, it echoes a little bit up here, but I can rephrase it too.
No,
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that people who have rejected God yet still seek to find meaning have found a lasting answer outside of relativism?
Is there a sure foundation for meaning if you have rejected meaning in God? The question.
What it means to reject meaning in... if you think that there's nothing but the material world, you can still not believe in God, right? I mean, you can believe, for example, that just as, let's say, there are principles of mathematics that are inscribed non-materially in the universe, there are principles of good and evil that are too, right? That would be distinctly a non-materialist view, because materialism would not be accounting for everything. But it doesn't amount to a belief in God, right? And meaning might work the same way. What the problem is if you really think that there's, and take in, not just profess, but actually take in, that there's nothing beyond the chain of cause and effect, which is, has no meaning or ethics attached to it. If you really take that in, then no, that you can't. But that doesn't mean God is the only way to express something alternative. God is just the way in which people have traditionally expressed that alternative. But it's not the only way.
I might say that, like, nobody lives out the full implications of their belief system consistently, right? So,
Except
I mean, like,
Russians.
someone who's a Christian isn't a Christian
who?
all the time.
Russians.
Except Russia.
Except for Russians. Except for the Russians. And so, and the other idea is you might, and this might seem like life itself is a gift that is given to us by God. So the idea that God only wants us to find him through misery, such that anyone who doesn't believe in him is going to have, like, nihilism that can only be pulled out of despair. He calls the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. And so life as a gift, as a thing that is enjoyable, is a gift given by the Creator, in my opinion, to people. And so I do believe that people can have senses of meaning, purpose, and joy, because there's an inherent dignity and sense of discovery and curiosity that's implanted in the human heart. And so I don't think that is the fullness of joy that we can have, but I don't believe that every single person who is not a Christian is walking around in existential despair. And I'm not sure that God has shaped the world such as that. I mean, you don't have to be a Christian. It's like, I remember I listened to this scientist, not to be flippant, but I don't remember what his discipline was. But I was at Dartmouth College, and he gave this long discussion about some element of science in the universe, and he was almost enraptured. And then he ended it with this idea. He said, it's almost like you want to say thank you to someone, but there's no one to say thank you to. That was his exact line. But he was a materialist, but he saw wonder. And so I think that human beings are capable of wonder. I think that the reason that, like, Lenin ultimately did not succeed is that I don't think he could completely eradicate the conscience from everybody. And so I think that it is hard for us to actually fully embrace on either side consistently the full implications of our worldviews.
Great question. Thank you. Next question.
Thank you so much for speaking. Dr. McCaulley, I have a question for you, which is I really liked what you said about Deuteronomy and how, like, to remember the past. So I grew up in China, and it's a communist country, and throughout my education, something that was continuously emphasized is never forget national humiliation, like 勿忘国耻. So my question is there a place for national memory in preserving hope, and should there be one?
I think that nations ought to have national memories, but our memories can do a lot of things. Sometimes our memories can teach us what not to do. And so one of the things that you actually read, if you just open up the Bible, most of the time the people in the Bible are doing the wrong things. They're murdering, killing, lying, cheating, stealing. There's kind of a bunch of knuckleheads in the Bible. And the point of that isn't to go, oh, I should be a knucklehead. It's like, maybe you shouldn't sell your wife. That's a bad call, right? That's what you're supposed to get. And so sometimes the point of the story is to know what not to do. And what I think the nations sometimes get in danger of, there's a fear of, if we fully acknowledge the evil that we've done, there is no future after that. And I actually want to say there is no future until you fully embrace the mistakes and failures of a nation, because lies can only be kept in place by violence. And that's the reason there's always the violent repression of uncomfortable truths when a nation doesn't want to own it. And I'm speaking of China because I'm not speaking about Chinese history. I'm talking about our own context here, that we need a national memory that is complex enough to speak about America's successes and our real deep failures. And it's only when we reconcile those things together that we can actually move forward as a country. Believe it or not, we're still fighting over we're consistently relitigating history, which is preventing us from moving forward. So I believe there's national memory that is both positive and negative that we have to embrace.
Let me just say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
what disturbed me about the way you describe national memory is that it's about national humiliation.
Yeah, the grievance.
If you define your this is Dostoevsky's key point, right? If you define yourself as a victim, as someone who's been humiliated, that means you will claim the right for revenge to somebody else. Humiliation is the worst thing to build psychology and national identity on.
Yeah, just to amplify that, one of the biggest problems we have in the South is our regional memory of humiliation.
Yeah.
And how that sense of victimhood has been wielded by the majority white culture in oppression against others, especially African Americans.
And maybe what I consider, I can't speak to China, so I'm not going to speak on it. But what that is the rewriting of history. So it's not that there's never been any injustice inflicted upon them. It's that the story is told in such a way that there's complete innocence. And when you have complete innocence, then there is only revenge. But when you're able to recognize mutual failure, then that gives space for mutual forgiveness. Right. And so that's what I was trying to get at. Owning the failures is a key part to moving forward.
Why not base, Chinese dignity on the immense treasures of Chinese literature and philosophy? Why fuse your identity with the unequal treaties? Why? I mean, that's not the way to do it.
It's a good question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Allie. I'm a grad student. I'm in U.S. history. You were right the first time. It's the Montgomery bus boycott.
Montgomery.
You got it. Yes. Thank you guys both for being here. My question is, I would love to hear how you each define hope in this conversation of hope and despair, and how your histories have influenced the way you define hope, and how your areas of specialty have changed the way you define hope.
For me, hope is the way that I live, the positive attitude towards life that I live until the final consummation of that in which I hope for. So I don't hope for me isn't like a positive attitude towards life. I actually believe that Jesus died and rose again, and there's a future that awaits me, and that my end is not despair and doom, but my end is joy. And so because of that, I believe that the world has purpose and meaning, and I approach the world from that perspective. And so my hope isn't necessarily an emotional analysis that shifts with the time. My hope is rooted in a person, and that person then influences how I live now, such that my job isn't to fix the world. My job is to bear witness to something that is greater than myself, and to serve those along the way. So hope is probably, I want to talk about a posture that I live in between two advents, the first coming of Jesus and what I think will be his second coming. You ask a theologian, you get a theological answer.
That's good. Another question?
What is your definition of hope?
Well, I'm a pessimist. When some of you know that for about 13 years, I taught a class with the previous Northwestern president, Morty Shapiro. We did it together. And at various points, when something horrible in history was mentioned, or something that could happen today, Morty would say, well, I believe in a providential God, and so I think things will work out. And my reply was, I'm not going to say anything against God, but if you could witness what went on in the 20th century and still have an optimistic view of human beings, I think you're impervious to any evidence. The problem is what people are and what bad capacities they have that is so easy to tap, and which I see, tapping more and more, then the more you can justify bad behavior by some ideology that tells you, divides the world into the good guys here, us guys, of course, and the bad guys there, and divide the line by, by social class, race, party, political, doesn't matter. You're headed for evil. And again, I quote Solzhenitsyn's probably most famous line: "The line between good and evil runs not through groups or parties, but straight through every human heart, including your own." And when you start seeing, we see so often, the evil is the other guy, just evil and we're good. When you just listen, when you get all your news from one self-righteous source that keeps reinforcing the same thing, you're going to think that. And then you're going to wind up being prepared to think infinite evil about the other. And once you do, you will be prepared either to commit or to sanction unspeakable violence against that other. You can't divide the world that way. And if you do, you are the one who is most likely to be committing evil. But people do. They do all the time. We've seen it all over the 20th century and up to now. And that's why, I'm a pessimist. I'm not hopeless. If I were hopeless, I would just resign, but I don't. I fight. I try to fight for what's good.
I might be a pessimist too. When I say, if you're asking me, do I have hope for the positive outcome of any particular struggle that I'm in the midst of, then the answer to that could be yes or no. But maybe what I'm saying is, I see my role, or the role of the church, as witness. And someone, like you said, like the guy who goes back to Russia, someone has to say that there's another way of being human. And to me, success is to have borne that witness. So that person who decides to go back and die, his death is not a tragedy. It is a witness to something that is bigger than himself. And so for me, I'm pessimistic in the sense that I've defined success as faithful witness than concrete progress in my lifetime.
You're saying it matters whether it has a political success or not. The witnessing for the good is itself a statement of human dignity and is a good in itself, and I completely agree with that.
I won.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems we've had about hope is investing our hope in being on the right side of history. Yeah. That language that things are progressing in such a way that I can be on the right side. What I studied here as an undergrad were 3 Christian leaders who opposed Adolf Hitler, who lost their lives or were kicked out of the country or jailed the entire time. They were not on the right side of history. Yeah. But we're studying them now.
Well, history
as examples.
History doesn't care about you. The universe doesn't care about you. The history doesn't love me. It sounds like that. I mean, when I say I care at 0 about the wrong side of history, what is history? History is nothing. It's a construct. So for me, what I'm talking about is, sorry, can I do Bible stuff for a second? I got to get permission. There's this the trial scene in the Gospel of John, where Jesus and Pilate are having a discussion about Jesus' innocence. And Jesus says, I come to bear witness to the truth. And Pilate poses the question, what is truth? But here's the thing, though. This is what he meant. What does truth matter when I have an army? And he's saying truth is what I say it is. But the whole idea, the whole premise of the resurrection is truth and power can be separated. Right? And there is a truth that exists outside of our ability to impose it upon people. And the resurrection is a vindication of that idea. And so that's the case. I don't have to worry about being on the wrong side of history, but on the right or the wrong side of a person. And so for me, it is always in my best moments this: what is true? What is true? And people might know the name Bull Connor. Well, people have forgotten the name Bull Connor. He was the guy who was in charge, the sheriff in Birmingham. We've forgotten Bull. We've forgotten George Wallace, segregation forever. We remember King. And so that's what matters.
The guy who said the church needs to be not a thermometer, taking the temperature, but a thermostat that changes.
Maybe it's just like, I think the people who remember are the people who stood on the side of truth. And I do think that if there is, can I give you one more historical of it? So there's this moment when the emancipation comes to Washington, D.C., and the slaves there have a celebration. And the slaves in D.C. are celebrating the freedom of the slaves. And you can read, I think it's there's a sermon where the person goes, it was not Abraham Lincoln who freed the slaves, it was God. And they celebrated, after all of these years of slavery, God's providential care. And so we might look back 200 years later and say, well, what has God done? Well, the person who had been liberated said, here's an act of progress. And what I'm saying to you is these moments in history are really about people who, against all odds, did the best they could to live on the side of truth. And to me, that's its own beauty. Even the people who wrote about it, who had the courage to write a book that asks real important questions rather than to display the rhetorical skill to not say anything at all. So maybe the only life worth living to me is one that explores deep questions of meaning, like Veritas.
That's good. I like it.
That's your thing.
They'll clip that one. Let's get another question. Let's hear from another student somewhere. Here's a question.
Hello, hi. My name is Darren. I'm a third-year medical student at Northwestern's medical school. We have a crowd here, so we're happy to represent.
Thanks for coming.
So one of the things that really shocked me when I went to med school was this idea, Dr. Morson, that you were talking about how in the medical profession, materialism has actually taken such a strong hold. And in many of my discussions, I've actually been quite shocked at how common that worldview is. So I wanted to ask, in your experiences in academia or in pastoral settings, what are the things you see today among the people you work with, either colleagues or students, how do they reflect that materialist worldview, and how would you address it and maybe propose a change?
So how would you respond to the materialist worldview as you saw it in discussions with your colleagues? He's talking about at the Northwestern Medical School of how they're seeing a kind of a surprising amount of that materialist ethic among other students and faculty.
By materialist ethic, you mean personal advancement? I'm not sure what you mean by...
No, I think it's the other, right?
I don't want to take too much time on the mic, but I can give an example about this if you would like.
Yeah, give an example. Go ahead.
Okay. This actually was about 2 months ago, 3 months ago. It really shook me to my core, if I'm being honest. It was a real case that happened at Northwestern where a patient was so depressed, clinically depressed, that he had attempted to commit suicide several times. And it was getting to the point where he was making these attempts in front of his own family. And he was saying it to his wife, to his kids, and basically everything around him had been addressed. So he'd gone to therapy, done all the meds, et cetera. And the psychiatrist who was taking care of this patient went to the medical ethics board and said, is there, I'm sorry, let me take a step back. The patient went to the psychiatrist and said, listen, doc, I've tried everything. Can you please help me pass away in dignity? Physician-assisted suicide. And the psychiatrist went to the ethics board, et cetera, all that happened. And then our class took a vote and said, what would you do in this case? Would you administer the medication so that the patient will die, or would you not do it? And I was actually shocked because of the group, I was in a group of 18 or so. I was the only one who said that I should not administer the medications. Basically, what they were arguing was that our interpretation of the patient's life having intrinsic value doesn't matter because the subjective experience that the patient was experiencing trumps some sort of overarching non-material view. So that's one manifestation of how I've seen the materialist ethic.
Yeah, so the example there is assisted suicide. Why not, as a medical professional, as a physician, assist in someone's suicide if that's what their subjective experience desires, regardless of whether they have intrinsic human value?
I think there are two questions that conflated here. One is, should there be assisted suicide or legal suicide? And the other is, should doctors be the one to do it? The last people in the world you want to do it is doctors. You want doctors to be there dedicated utterly to life. Otherwise, the hospital is going to say, keeping this patient alive is costing too much money. We need room for others. It's going to happen, right? Doctors should have a single perspective. If you want to, have, somebody else, an assisted suicide profession, the way we have, people selling cannabis, I guess. I mean,
The weed guy and the death guy probably shouldn't be in the same strip mall, probably.
I was hoping I'd get a laugh out of that, but I wasn't sure. Do it with somebody else. But I think, look, lots of people, if you've ever been severely depressed, you think that there is no way out, and you want to commit suicide. And 5 years later, you've gotten over it, and you are thankful that you didn't, because life is of infinite, irreplaceable value. And what's more, the people who you also affect will be glad too. Once you start down on the road of, okay, you're not happy with life, here, take this, you're gone. I don't want to live in that world.
I think we got time for another question, I think. We got the mic back here. The question, that was a great question, by the way. Thank you. Haunting, though, I agree. Go ahead.
And as he walks over there, that particular issue, as best as I can follow what's going on in Canada, is that it has extended beyond to like real pressure for people. People who feel like pressured to end their lives, and so
doctors are pressured.
And doctors are pressured. So I'm on the side of the intrinsic value of life. In case we're getting,
especially in certain political systems as well. UK is another one.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alexandra. I'm a chemistry PhD student. And I haven't fully formed this thought, but I know what I want to ask, so hopefully you'll catch the question. But I think for me, it has a lot to do with like resilience and kind of like the emotional like burden that you could be feeling, especially in America today, just kind of feeling the weight of, a lot of people's difficulties and almost experiencing like constant burnout and wondering how do we take on resilience? How do we hold on to hope? And where can we rest? Especially when it's like, it's not our problem, it's maybe the problem of our neighbor, of our friend, but just realizing that they're struggling, that they're suffering, that they're scared, especially when it comes to like questions of immigration. Like, how do you hold on to hope? And how can you stay resilient when this is constantly a problem and it seems to only be getting worse?
This may seem counterintuitive, but the first thing I would do is to say to rest. We live in a world where all of the problems are available to us all of the time, and the algorithm knows what to feed you to trigger you, and the algorithm doesn't love you or care about you, nor does it care about your emotional well-being. And so one of the things that you have to learn is that how to actually take a break from saving the world. And the second thing I would say is to do the good that is in front of you and the good that is controllable versus existential, like pondering things that you can't fix. And so, for example, in our where we are in our church, there are 2 or 3 people who deal with immigrants and who are helping families who are here integrate into the United States. And there are never enough people who want to mentor and walk with these families through the process of just becoming a part of American culture, helping with jobs and kids and families. But there are more people who will tweet and talk about that than people who will volunteer. And so I think that trying to do all the good everywhere will lead you to exhaustion. Doing the good in a particular place is probably a sense of meaning. One of the things that I used to do this a whole lot more. I used to travel around, but I'm only here because Mickey convinced me to do it. Because I spent so much time talking about doing stuff that I didn't actually have time to do the stuff that I spoke about. So I actually reduced my travel. I only live an hour and a half from here because now I actually have space in my life to do concrete good to people. There may not be videos that are recordings of it, and there may not be people who come to hear it, but for my own soul, doing a particular good in a particular place has been way more meaningful to me than traveling all over the country talking about good. And I want to suggest that maybe thinking about it, pondering it, trying to convince your neighbor or your family member that the bad thing is actually bad may be less productive than doing the good thing that is available to you. So rest and serve locally would be my 2 pieces of advice.
Do you have one more question? You want one more question or ready? One more. Okay, right there in the front.
When someone acts out of religious conviction, is that act always fundamentally an expression, though, of hope and optimism, or is it sometimes better understood as a sense of duty or obligation?
Hope. Why don't you dig on?
Is when someone who does something out of religious conviction, are they doing it out of a sense of duty or out of a sense of hope? I don't think it always matters. So, like, some days I get up and I exercise because I want to exercise. Sometimes I don't want to exercise and I don't want to get a heart attack. So I run. But both of those things reduce calories. And I think that maybe we have an idea that things are only true if we feel them emotionally. But I think that doing things out of duty is actually a good thing. We actually need people who are willing to do things because one of the things you will learn, because I was poor and mean, that poor people can be mean. And if you expect some kind of endorphin response from every act of goodness, it's not gonna happen. And it's gonna be annoying to deal with poor people all of the time. And if you need some emotion that's gonna feedback, you're gonna go to work or do whatever that thing is out of a sense of obligation. And so I think that obligation and emotional sentiment are 2 things that aren't necessary to be companions in order for the good effect to come.
One, some people do good thinking, and then I'm going to earn this gratitude from these people, right? And of course, very often people are not grateful. For example, sick people, tend to be rather irritable, and they're not grateful, right? And if you're doing it for gratitude, you're no longer doing good, you're just doing it like someone earning a wage, only the wage is not paid in money, it's paid in thanks or gratitude. Then you're not really doing good, right? If you really want to do good, you just do it, and duty is a perfectly good way to help you do that.
Darren's come on back up, but please help me in thanking our speakers for this evening.